Hey guys, and tonight we slip into one of those stories that looks harmless from a distance, like a faded Tudor painting hanging quietly in some forgotten gallery. But the moment you lean closer, the colors shift, the shadows breathe, and you won't survive this one if you still believe courtly love was ever a soft, romantic thing. Picture yourself standing in a long corridor, lit only by trembling candle flames, the stone floor cold beneath your feet, and beyond the windows the wind scrapes along the walls of Hampton Court, carrying whispers that have been buried for 5 centuries. The air feels heavy, as if the past itself is exhaling against your neck. And right there in that dim threshold begins the story of a man remembered as a lover, though the truth is far uglier than the myths carved around his name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while we're about to peel back layers of darkness, the Tudors tried very hard to hide. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now, because tonight's story stretches time thin, holding you between then and now like a candle trapped in its own wax. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The tale doesn't begin with a kiss, a secret letter, or any of the familiar decorations people love to drape over Tudor scandals. It begins in a forest in Kent, sometime in the spring of the year 1540, where a woman walked alone along a moss-soft path shaded by dense branches, the sun breaking through just enough to outline her breath. The forest carried the kind of quiet that tricks you into thinking you're safe, and no one, least of all her, could have imagined how violently that silence was about to be ripped apart. 4 or maybe 5 men on horseback emerged from the trees, surrounding her. One dismounted, his name Thomas Culpeper. Not the tragic lover history later painted him to be, but a man who understood all too well that power granted him permission to behave like an animal. It happened quickly, brutally. According to a letter written by the London merchant Richard Hills in May of the year 1542, Culpeper violated the woman while 3 or 4 of his attendants held her down at his command. Her screams vanished into the canopy, absorbed by the ancient trunks, as though the forest itself had learned long ago that Tudor England rarely listened to women. When local villagers arrived drawn by her cries, they saw not a courtier but a predator, one who didn't bother to flee. Culpeper resisted arrest, and in the struggle, he killed one of the men trying to bring him in. Blood darkened the soil. Justice, for a moment, seemed possible. He was taken into custody, bound, held. The kind of crime that should have led straight to the gallows. But justice in Henry's England was not a scale, it was a puppet. On the 12th day of July in the year 1540, the Court of King's Bench recorded something chilling in its dry, bureaucratic script. Thomas Culpeper did not appear to stand trial. Instead, a signet warrant was delivered, a royal pardon, signed by Henry VIII himself. No punishment, no reckoning. Just freedom granted with the casual ease of a man tossing scraps to a favored hunting dog. Why? Because Culpeper was not simply another courtier. He was the king's mirror, young, athletic, charming. Everything Henry was no longer in his swollen, infected middle age. As Henry's ulcerated leg continued to rot, and his mood swung like a blade on a fraying rope, Culpeper became the embodiment of the youth the king had lost. So the king kept him close, fed him favors, land, offices, wealth, even immunity. The palace whispered, but quietly, too quietly. No one wanted to test how far the king's affection stretched. To understand the horror of what would later unfold, you have to sit inside this moment, the moment when Henry VIII, a man with the authority to impose life or death by a simple gesture, chose to protect a violent offender because he enjoyed the man's company. Imagine Culpeper walking through the palace corridors afterward, boots striking the stone with a confidence he hadn't earned but had been gifted. Imagine the servants turning away, the ladies lowering their eyes, knowing exactly what he had done and exactly who had shielded him. He was a wolf dressed in velvet, a danger everyone recognized yet no one dared confront. And this choice, this single stroke of Henry's pen, created the path that would eventually close around a 17-year-old girl named Catherine Howard. But not yet. For now, this first part of our journey exists to show you that nothing in Catherine's tragedy began with love, or even with betrayal. It began here, in a forest, with a crime erased by power. It began with Henry deciding that the suffering of an anonymous woman mattered less than the laughter of a courtier he adored. In Tudor England, the king's whims drew the borders of justice, and every decision he made left ripples. Some ripples became storms, and one of those storms would one day fall directly on the neck of a young queen who never understood how deeply the roots of her fate had already been planted. And as you sit here in the dim glow of your own room, listening to the hum around you, remember that what happened next was not destiny, it was consequence. The palace feels different once you know what Thomas Culpeper carried behind his pleasant smile. And as we drift deeper into the corridors of the year 1537, the air grows heavier, as though the walls themselves remember what people prefer to forget. Henry VIII was 46 then, a man already at war with his own body, moving through Hampton Court with the careful steps of someone hiding both pain and pride. His legs swollen, ulcered, weeping dragged behind him like a chained animal. And every day the king felt time carving its initials into him. So when Culpeper appeared among the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, shining with youth and vitality, something inside Henry stirred. He did not fall in love, not in any romantic sense, but rather in that sharp, aching way an aging man sometimes clings to a younger reflection of himself, hoping it might slow the collapse of everything he used to be. The Privy Chamber was the heart of power, a small world within a world, guarded by silence and proximity. Only a handful of men were allowed so close to the king that they laced his boots, attended him in bed, handled his weapons, laughed at his jokes, absorbed his tempers, and saw the truth of him that the public was never meant to witness. To enter that circle was to step into the bloodstream of the monarchy, and Culpeper slipped into it with ease. Henry liked him immediately, liked the way he rode, the way he laughed, the way he carried himself like a man untouched by fear or consequence. And Culpeper, who had grown up in the court's shadows since he was a boy, knew exactly how to tilt his head, how to charm, how to become indispensable. He learned Henry's moods the way a sailor learns tides, speaking when the king wanted noise and disappearing when the king wanted silence. But if anyone hoped proximity to power would smooth Culpeper's rough edges, they misjudged him. The same reckless hunger that led him into the forest of Kent pulsed quietly beneath his polished exterior. Yet Henry rewarded him for it lavishly, repeatedly. By June of the year 1538, Culpeper had been appointed keeper of the armory for the king's own body. Land poured into his hands like water into a basin estates in Kent, Essex, Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, newly dissolved monastery lands broken apart and redistributed during the king's Reformation, now settled into Culpeper's pockets as casually as if they were trinkets to be tossed across a table. One could walk through entire villages and find Culpeper's name on doors, inventories, taxes, boundaries. Each gift a reminder that Henry's affection was a treasure chest with no lock. And the more Henry gave him, the more the court grew wary. In those rooms where tapestries softened the drafts and jewels glittered against candlelight, people learned to watch Culpeper without appearing to. They saw the swagger he carried, the ease with which he ignored rules that strangled lesser men. They saw how close he stood to the king, close enough to murmur into Henry's ear, close enough to see the infection on the king's leg and pretend not to notice the smell. They saw how Henry laughed more readily when Culpeper was near, and how his temper sharpened when Culpeper was absent. In a world where survival meant predicting the king's mood, Culpeper was a dangerous weather vane, too influential, too adored, too capable of bending the king's will with nothing more than a grin. But even more dangerous was the lesson Henry unknowingly taught him that some men are simply untouchable. That royal favor is a shield thick enough to hide murder. That punishment is for the poor, the disposable, The inconvenient not for men who remind a king of his own fading brilliance. Culpeper learned that lesson so deeply it sprouted roots. Every gesture Henry made toward him, every estate, every promotion, every joke shared across a table fed the belief that he could not fall. And in the Tudor world, where ambition smoldered in every corner like candle embers, there is nothing more perilous than a young man convinced he is immortal. Yet the court whispered, it always whispered. In the long galleries where footsteps echoed like thoughts, servants traded glances when Culpeper passed. Ladies of the court stiffened their posture, not in admiration but caution. Even men with titles traced the contours of Culpeper's rise with uneasy fascination. They remembered the story of the forest, or fragments of it. They heard it the way people hear storms on the horizon, some denying, some fearing, all aware that power does not erase violence. It only hides it long enough for the next strike. And Henry, wrapped in his own need for distraction, did not care. Perhaps he did not want to see. Perhaps it soothed something in him to keep a man like Culpeper near a man still untouched by decay, untouched by regret. But every smile exchanged between them, every gift, every moment of easy camaraderie was a stone placed quietly on a path that led nowhere good. The king, in trying to borrow youth, strengthened the ambitions of a man who already knew how to turn privilege into permission. As summer after summer rolled across England, Culpeper grew richer, bolder, more deeply woven into the fabric of Henry's daily life. And somewhere far from the privy chamber, in the noisy and chaotic household of Agnes Howard, a girl named Catherine was growing up without realizing that her life would one day intersect with his, and that the man she would be told was her lover had already shown the world what he was capable of when no one stopped him. The future queen walked through her girlhood with no idea that her fate had already been nudged by the king's pen the day he pardoned the man who would help unravel her life. For now, though, she remains a distant figure in this unfolding tapestry, a soft outline at the edge of a portrait still dominated by the king and his favorite. Because to understand the tragedy of Catherine Howard, you must first understand the environment that shaped Thomas Culpeper, a palace that rewarded charm more than virtue, a king who mistook charisma for loyalty, and a court so used to violence dressed in silk that it often failed to see danger until it was already sitting beside them at the table. And while no one in Henry's orbit could yet see the storm forming, the first winds were already stirring, brushing quietly against Culpeper's velvet sleeves. The story drifts now toward a place far quieter than the privy chamber, a place where royal power does not reach and where the candles burn cheaper, dimmer, and faster. Long before Catherine Howard stepped into the path of Thomas Culpeper, she lived in a world that looked nothing like a queen's childhood, a world shaped not by jewels or etiquette, but by noise and neglect, a swirling chaos tucked inside the household of the Dowager Duchess Agnes Howard. If Culpeper's rise showed how privilege shields the dangerous, then Catherine's upbringing revealed how vulnerability is cultivated not through a single catastrophe, but through a steady, unbroken absence of protection. The Dowager Duchess's home was less a noble residence and more a boarding house bursting at the seams with young bodies, voices, wants, and secrets. Girls of varying ages slept in shared chambers, their beds pushed close together beneath beams that creaked at night. Young men musicians, secretaries, servants came and went through the corridors like streams flowing through an unguarded mill. No locked doors, no vigilant chaperones, no one to tell a girl where danger began or where it could lead. Everything in that house breathed disorder, a kind of careless rhythm that trained Catherine not to expect boundaries because none were ever given to her. She arrived there as a child, too young to understand the currents she had been dropped into. Her parents were not present, the Dowager Duchess was occupied with her own concerns, and the staff were overwhelmed. Girls like Catherine learned early that survival required listening, watching, adapting. They learned to read moods instead of rules. They learned that their worth was measured by beauty rather than safety. The household did not intend harm, it simply failed to prevent it. And in that failure, the cracks beneath Catherine's feet began to widen. It was in that environment, at the fragile age of 13, that her music teacher, Henry VIII, began to touch her. There was no one to intervene, no one to draw a protective circle around her childhood. Mannix spoke to her softly, pressed too close during lessons, let his hands linger, and Catherine, without guidance, without warning, did not know how to name what was happening. Later, during interrogations years in the future, she would admit that their interactions had been physical. Historians debate whether she understood the implications at the time. The truth is, she was barely past childhood, a girl still learning the sound of her own voice. In that household, adults did not protect her, they scolded her. When the Dowager Duchess found out, she did not ask what Mannix had done. She asked what Catherine had allowed, and then she sent Mannix away, not in punishment, but in annoyance, as though he were an inconvenience rather than a threat. That moment shaped something in Catherine, an understanding that men could act with impunity, and she would carry the consequences. The lesson did not remain theoretical for long. By the time she was perhaps 15, another man stepped into the void left by the first. Francis Derham was older, confident, and persistent in a way Catherine could not resist because she had never been taught how. To some observers, their relationship looked affectionate, the playful companionship, the whispered conversations, the hours Derham spent slipping into the girls' dormitory long after night had folded itself around the house. But affection is a complicated mask. Some historians argue that Catherine reciprocated his attentions, believing they might lead to a future marriage. Others point out the undeniable imbalance, Derham navigating the world as an adult, Catherine still searching for her place in it, a girl fresh out of one exploitation only to stumble into another. The truth is that Catherine lived in a space where choice was a word adults invoked, but rarely granted. Derham pressed himself into her life with the confidence of someone who has never been told no. He held her hand, he shared her bed, he whispered promises in the dark. Maybe she believed him. Maybe she simply complied. Maybe she feared the consequences of refusing. Whatever the mixture, it paved a path whose shadows would stretch years ahead into places Catherine could not yet imagine. When Mannix, resentful and jealous, sent the anonymous letter exposing Derham's visits to Catherine's chamber, the Dowager Duchess stormed through the dormitory with righteous fury, not at the man climbing into a 15-year-old's bed, but at Catherine for letting herself be compromised. Derham was sent away, and the matter was considered closed. Catherine was warned to protect her beauty, not her well-being. The adults who should have safeguarded her instead confirmed that her safety was her own responsibility, even though she was given none of the tools to protect it. Through those years, the girl who would one day wear a crown learned an unspoken truth when men wanted something from her. There would be no help. She would navigate the danger alone. And danger in the Tudor world was not lurking in alleys or shadowed forests. It walked through drawing rooms, laughed at dinners, wore velvet sleeves and gold rings. It looked friendly. It smelled of wine and power. Catherine learned to smile when expected, to obey when pressed, to fear when ignored. And when the time came to enter court, she carried that repertoire of survival with her like a second skin she could not shed. When she arrived in the service of Anne of Cleves in the year 1539, she was still a girl, bright, affectionate, sweet in a way people found charming but naive. Those who met her described her as a little sweet fool, not out of cruelty but because Catherine lacked the training most noble girls receive from birth. She did not understand politics. She did not understand courtly strategy. She certainly did not understand how dangerous it was to be beautiful in a place where kings hunted beauty like trophies. Her path toward Henry VIII was not one she chose. It simply unfolded around her, a familiar pattern repeating itself on a much grander scale. A powerful man decided he wanted her, and she had no tools to refuse. The lessons from the Dowager Duchess's household followed her like ghosts, whispering that compliance was safety, that submission was survival, that when men wanted something, resistance only invited punishment. But before the crown, before the courtship, before the sudden rise that would lift her into view of a throne she was unequipped to navigate, Catherine was simply a girl growing up in a house that taught her to be afraid without teaching her how to fight. And it was in those dim, chaotic corridors that the tragedy of her future was seated, not by malice, not by destiny, but by the profound absence of guidance at the moments she needed it most. Because when Thomas Culpeper eventually turned his gaze toward her, she would fall back on the only instincts she had ever been taught: stay quiet, survive, and hope the danger passes. She could not know that this time. The danger would not pass. Catherine's path into the royal court might look, from the outside, like a doorway into privilege, but for a girl shaped by neglect and improvised survival, it was more like stepping into a labyrinth whose walls she couldn't yet see. When she arrived as a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves in the closing days of the year 1539, she entered a world built on performance, every smile calculated, every gesture observed, every whisper potentially lethal. The palace shimmered with satin and ceremony, but beneath the glitter lay a tension older than the stones themselves, a constant pressure that tested even the most seasoned courtiers. Catherine, with her hopeful eyes and unguarded warmth, moved through this new world as though she were still navigating the Dowager Duchess's crowded halls, unaware that every step she took left a trace in a place where traces could be turned into weapons. It was here that Henry VIII first saw her, and something shifted. Henry, nearly 50, carried his age like a burden strapped to his bones. His body was a battlefield-infected leg, mounting weight, exhaustion that clung to him like a second cloak. Nights were filled with pain, days with the grim awareness that the vigor he once displayed on horseback and in tourneys had long since deserted him. Power remained, but the illusion of youth had evaporated. And then Catherine appeared young, bright, unweathered by the storms that had scarred him. She moved with the lightness Henry no longer possessed. She smiled with a sincerity he had not seen in years. And something in him, loneliness, vanity, longing, perhaps all three clutched at her image with a hunger he barely understood. Catherine had no idea the king's gaze had settled on her. If she noticed Henry watching her, she might have interpreted it as courtesy or curiosity, not desire. How could she imagine that she, among all the polished and politically trained women of the court, had become the focus of a monarch whose whims could redraw the entire landscape of her life? The truth is, she did not choose Henry. Henry chose her. And in the Tudor court, when a king chose, the world rearranged itself around his decision, whether the chosen wanted it or not. The marriage to Anne of Cleves had grown stale almost before it began. Henry found Anne physically unappealing in opinion, the court echoed back to him with careful enthusiasm. The union remained unconsummated, a source of quiet humiliation the king refused to carry alone. Advisors whispered solutions, courtiers nodded in agreement. The machinery of annulment began to turn, slow but deliberate, like gears grinding inside a massive clock. And as the king's marriage disintegrated, Catherine's proximity became more dangerous by the day. She didn't seek his attention. She didn't have to. The king's desire did the work for her. By the summer of the year 1540, the annulment was complete. Anne acquiesced with a grace that spared her life a rare escape from Henry's matrimonial disasters. Catherine, meanwhile, found herself ushered through a transformation she could not have foreseen. One morning she was a maid of honor, folding linens and attending queenly rituals. The next, she stood as Henry's chosen bride, barely 17. The crown pressed onto her not as reward, but as inevitability. Her youth, which should have been a shield, instead became the chains closing around her future. Imagine her in those early days as queen, wearing gowns that felt too heavy, moving through rooms where people bowed too deeply, smiling because she believed she had to. She understood the role only from the outside, through stories and observations, not through teaching or preparation. Queenship required strategy, restraint, political instinct, and relentless caution. Catherine had never been taught any of those things. She knew only how to survive adults' demands, how to endure unwanted attentions, how to remain silent when confused or frightened. These instincts had once protected her, In the palace, they isolated her. Henry's affection, so intoxicating at first, came with expectations Catherine could not meet. He wanted her to be a balm to his insecurities, a symbol of his virility, a source of youthful radiance he could absorb by proximity. He wanted her to adore him, fear him, comfort him, admire him all at once. Catherine, raised without guidance, responded as she always had. She smiled. She complied. She tried to be what the powerful man in her life needed, even if she did not understand the price. But the palace was not merely a home, it was a crucible. Every eye studied her. Every word she spoke was weighed, every gesture interpreted. And while the king adored her, others watched with sharpened interest. The Howard family saw opportunity. Rival factions looked for weakness. Servants whispered. Courtiers assessed how long the king's fascination might last. Catherine, without mentorship, drifted through this world as though walking across a lake whose ice grew thinner with each step. The king's leg worsened. The smell of infection lingered in rooms long after he left them. His temper snapped unpredictably, sometimes over trifles, sometimes without reason. Catherine learned quickly that her husband's body housed storms waiting to break, storms she could neither predict nor calm. And though Henry showered her with jewels, praise, and lavish affection, he also brought with him a weight Catherine could not carry: his emotional hunger, his need to rewrite his own aging through her youth, his desperation to believe that marrying a 17-year-old made him powerful rather than vulnerable. In these early months, before scandals surfaced and before danger revealed its teeth, Catherine lived in a quiet tension, a queen by title but a girl by experience, trying to inhabit a role that had a long history of consuming women whole. She didn't yet know that her past was trailing behind her like a fuse, or that the man Henry treasured most, Thomas Culpeper, would soon turn his attention toward her. For now, Catherine moved through the palace as though her life had been rewritten into a fairy tale, unaware that fairy tales in Tudor England were always preludes to tragedy. The foundation of her downfall was already forming, stone by stone, in choices she had never made: Henry's indulgence of Culpeper, her family's negligence, the court's hunger for novelty, the king's aching loneliness. She walked among these forces like a candle wandering through drafts, fragile, glowing, destined to be extinguished by a wind she never saw coming. Catherine's days as queen drifted forward with a fragile, uncertain rhythm, the kind that feels steady only because no one dares admit how easily it could fracture. The court dressed her in silk and jewels, but beneath those layers lived the same girl shaped by fear and improvisation, a girl who had learned to navigate danger by smiling through it. She might have believed, for a brief moment, that the past she carried like a shadow had been left behind in the Dowager Duchess's house. But the past is a patient predator. It waits, it listens, and it follows quietly, even into a throne room. The first tremor came not from scandal or whispers, but from the reappearance of Francis Derham, the man who had once slid through the darkness of the girls' dormitory to share her bed. He returned not as a lover, and certainly not as a friend, but as a reminder of nights Catherine never volunteered for, of promises she couldn't keep, of power imbalances she never understood. Derham did not step into her queenly household by accident. He entered with purpose, carrying with him a dangerous mixture of entitlement and knowledge. In the Tudor world, men like him knew that secrets were currency, and Catherine was a vault worth opening. He came with a recommendation from the Dowager Duchess, a gesture steeped in equal parts strategy and denial. Perhaps the old woman truly believed bringing Derham into Catherine's household would silence him. Perhaps she feared the consequences if he were excluded. Or perhaps she simply didn't grasp that the stakes for a queen were lethal. Whatever her reasoning, the effect was the same. The past Catherine had tried to outrun now walked beside her, breathing over her shoulder. Derham did not settle into his new role quietly. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed proximity to the queen entitled him to advantages. His voice, once whispered through nighttime corridors, now echoed in the rooms of her household. He hinted. He boasted. He let bits of their past drip into conversation like poison. Servants heard him, attendants heard him, and Catherine heard him too, not just the words, but the intent behind them. Derham had always acted as though she belonged to him, and now, with her elevated position, he believed he deserved a share of her new power. But power at court was a dangerous illusion. Catherine had the title of queen, the gowns of a queen, the public ceremonies of a queen, yet she had none of the political instincts that queens needed to survive. She did what she had always done when intimidated. She yielded. She gave Derham a place close to her, appointed him as a secretary, let him remain near. To her, it must have seemed like the safest choice. Keep him quiet, keep him satisfied, keep the threat contained. Silence, after all, had kept her alive before. But the palace was not the Dowager Duchess's house. Every move Catherine made reverberated through rooms full of watchful eyes. Her household staff had seen enough queens come and go to know when something felt amiss. People noticed Derham's confidence. They noticed his familiarity. They noticed his arrogance swelling with each passing week. And they whispered about it, tiny murmurs that drifted from servant to chambermaid to gentleman usher, rising like smoke toward the rafters where rumors gathered strength. Meanwhile, Catherine herself was adrift in a role she did not know how to perform. She had no mentor, no training, no political allies who could shield her. The Howard family, who should have guided her, saw her primarily as a tool the crown placed upon her head was a victory for them, not for her. They focused on maintaining favor, not on teaching her how to survive the labyrinth of courtly intrigue. And so Catherine stood alone at the center of a widening circle of danger. Henry, though still doting and generous, was absorbed by matters of state and his own fluctuating health. His leg continued to deteriorate. The infection pulsing beneath bandages changed several times a day. His moods were erratic, his patience thin. He wanted Catherine to be a source of warmth and youthfulness, not anxiety. She learned quickly to hide her fear, to bury her unease beneath laughter and charm. The king adored her smile, so she learned to deploy it like armor. But each time Derham spoke too casually, each time he let slip a suggestive comment, each time he lingered too close, the cracks beneath Catherine widened. She must have felt them spreading beneath her feet, even if she didn't yet recognize their shape. The palace was listening, the walls were listening, and somewhere in the swirling mass of courtiers and servants, a man like Thomas Culpeper was listening too. He would have heard the whispers about Catherine's past. He would have seen Derham moving through her rooms with a confidence no man should display toward a queen. And for someone like Culpeper, ambitious, calculating, already accustomed to pushing boundaries, this was not a warning. It was an opportunity. But that part of the story belongs to what comes next. For now, the danger creeping toward Catherine was quiet and shapeless, woven from memories she tried to forget and mistakes she never realized she was making. She had stepped into the glittering chambers of queenship carrying wounds no one else could see, and every day those wounds grew more exposed. The palace around her shimmered with candlelight and ceremony, but beneath that golden surface, the past was waking. Derham's return had set something in motion, a slow, inevitable unraveling that neither Catherine nor the king nor the court could yet perceive. She still smiled in public. She still danced. She still played the part expected of her, but in the dimmer corners of her household, in the pauses between duties, she must have sensed it, the feeling that her life was no longer entirely her own, that forces she did not understand were gathering, that something dark and unstoppable was beginning to circle her, soft at first, almost gentle, but tightening with every passing day. The shadows around Catherine began to thicken almost imperceptibly at first, the way twilight folds itself around a room long before anyone reaches for a candle. Derham's presence had stirred the air, unsettled the balance of her fragile new life. But it was Thomas Culpeper who stepped into that disturbance with the confidence of someone who had always believed the world would bend for him. If Derham represented the past Catherine could not escape, Culpeper represented the danger she had never been taught to anticipate, a man who had already crossed boundaries others feared and had suffered no consequence for doing so. In the months after Catherine became queen, Culpeper moved through the court with renewed boldness. Henry's affection had only deepened. The king relied on him for companionship, laughter, distraction from the decay of his own body. Culpeper, dressed in rich fabrics, carried himself like a man sculpted from privilege, and radiated an ease that drew eyes wherever he went. He understood the power of charm, the utility of silence, and the advantage of knowing secrets that were not his. And when talk of Catherine's past began circulating through the quiet channels of courtly gossip, tiny ripples at first, barely audible, Culpeper listened. He would have heard the servants speak of Derham standing too close, whispering too much, hinting at things that should never be spoken around a queen. He would have noted the tension in Catherine's movements, the flicker of worry behind her bright demeanor. And because Culpeper had spent years honing his instincts in the volatile environment of Henry's inner circle, he sensed vulnerability the way a predator senses the tremor of prey in the underbrush. Catherine was young, inexperienced, poorly protected, and now tethered to a man from her past who could ruin her if he chose. To Culpeper, this did not signal caution, it signaled opportunity. He began by drifting near her during progressions through the palace, offering comments carefully designed to appear harmless, but waited just enough to test her reaction. Catherine, already juggling the strain of Derham's presence, met Culpeper's advances with polite discomfort. She knew he was close to the king. She knew he was dangerous in ways she could not articulate. And she knew, instinctively, that pushing him away too firmly could ignite the very suspicion she feared. Her refusals were soft, hesitant, the refusals of someone who had been taught all her life that resistance only sharpens men's tempers. But Culpeper was not a man deterred by subtlety. The privilege Henry had showered upon him had shaped a confidence that moved dangerously close to entitlement. And entitlement in the Tudor court was a currency rarely challenged. He began sending messages through intermediaries, and when that proved too slow, he approached Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, no stranger to whispered schemes in hidden rooms, under pressure, confusion, or perhaps a misguided sense of loyalty to the queen she served. Lady Rochford became the bridge between Catherine and Culpeper, a role that would ultimately destroy her. Historians later recorded Catherine's own words, preserved in the interrogations that followed her downfall. "Will this never end?" she had asked Lady Rochford in weariness. It was not a lover's lament. It was the plea of a young woman pressed on all sides by men who believed her body and her silence belonged to them. Those words reveal more than any letter or confession could ever show. They reveal a girl who was being hunted, not pursued. Culpeper's persistence increased. He appeared where Catherine walked, stood where she sat, maneuvered himself into places where she could not avoid him without drawing attention. His smiles, once effortless, now carried an intent sharper than any blade. He had no need to rush. Pressure applied slowly is often more effective. Catherine found herself in a tightening loop, Derham's presence haunting her from behind, Culpeper closing in from the front, and the vast machinery of the Tudor court grinding silently around her. As summer faded into autumn, Lady Rochford arranged the first of the secret meetings. They took place in rooms tucked away from the main chambers, places where footsteps could be heard long before they arrived, places where the air felt close and heavy. Catherine entered these encounters not with excitement, but with dread. Not as a queen meeting a lover, but as a frightened girl trying to prevent a disaster she could not fully define. Culpeper, accustomed to getting what he wanted, believed her compliance was consent. He mistook fear for affection. He interpreted her attempts to placate him as desire. The truth is simpler and far more tragic. Catherine had been taught all her life that powerful men could ruin her. Mannix had taught her. Derham had reinforced it. The Dowager Duchess's furious scoldings had cemented it, and now Culpeper embodied it. Her attempts to appease him were not flirtation, they were survival. The palace, however, saw none of this. Courtiers only saw a queen slipping into rooms at odd hours. Servants saw Lady Rochford standing guard behind locked doors. Those who envied Catherine whispered eagerly. Those who feared the king remained silent. And the king, wrapped in self-importance and physical pain, remained oblivious to the storm gathering beneath his very nose. But storms do not stay hidden forever. Each quiet meeting, each lingering glance, each rumor drifting from one pair of lips to another, laid another brick on the path leading toward catastrophe. Culpeper believed he was destined for greater things than Henry's death, which some whispered might come sooner rather than later, could open a future in which he stood beside Catherine as consort. He dreamed of ascending, not realizing that he had already stepped into the jaws of a trap constructed not by enemies, but by his own arrogance. Catherine, meanwhile, felt the pressure tightening like cords being drawn around her ribs. She had not yet fallen, but she had begun to recognize that she was no longer standing on solid ground. The choices she made were not choices at all. They were desperate attempts to keep the past from resurfacing and the present from exploding. Every time she met Culpeper in secrecy, she believed she was controlling the danger, when in truth the danger was controlling her. And somewhere at the edge of this tightening web, Archbishop Cranmer was already beginning to hear the first faint whispers, thin threads of rumor drifting into the ears of a man who knew how quickly whispers could become weapons. The storm was coming. Catherine could feel it. Culpeper was feeding it. And the court, ever hungry for tragedy, was waiting. The northern progress of the year 1541 should have been a triumph, an extravagant procession meant to display the king's power, the queen's beauty, and the stability Henry so desperately wanted the kingdom to believe he possessed. But while banners fluttered and drums echoed across the countryside, something else moved in the shadows of that journey, something quieter, more dangerous, a thread tightening between Catherine and Culpeper. With every mile the procession advanced. The further they traveled from London, the further Catherine drifted from the illusion of control she had clung to, as though the road itself were pulling her toward a fate written long before she ever entered the palace. Progresses were both spectacle and confinement. Thousands of attendants, endless wagons, tents, servants, guards, and noble guests turned the world around Catherine into a kind of shifting labyrinth where privacy was rare, yet secrecy strangely possible. The queen lived at the center of a swirling mass of bodies and voices, a world where the clang of armor overlapped with the shuffle of chambermaids and the low murmur of political plotting. In such chaos, it became dangerously easy for Lady Rochford to slip Culpeper through side passages, for doors to be locked from the inside, for time to stretch and bend behind thick curtains while the rest of the world marched onward. Catherine's fear deepened with each arranged meeting, though she worked tirelessly to conceal it beneath the polished surface expected of a queen. She played her role during feasts, smiled during ceremonies, rode beside the king with grace, her laughter floating lightly into the summer air. But the moment she was back inside her chambers, the walls seemed to pulse with the memory of Culpeper's presence. His footsteps lingered in her mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. Each time Lady Rochford whispered that he must see her again, Catherine felt the noose tighten. She still complied because compliance had always been her shield, but the shield was cracking. The meetings themselves were small pockets of suffocating silence. Catherine entered with a posture that tried to convey confidence, but she carried the same tremor she had brought into the Dowager Duchess's dormitory years before, when Derham whispered over her shoulder. Culpeper greeted her with the warm confidence of a man who believed her discomfort was shyness. Her reluctance was longing. He interpreted her every flinch as an invitation to push further. He did not understand that Catherine was trapped not between desire and duty, but between terror and survival. If he ever sensed the fear beneath her composure, he mistook it for the thrill of secrecy rather than the dread of entrapment. It was during this progress that Catherine wrote the letter that would later be used as proof of a great consuming love. "I never longed so much for anything as I do to see you," she wrote, words that would haunt her beyond death. But within the context of her life, the letter reads differently, more like a plea than a profession. She needed Culpeper calm. She needed him satisfied. She needed the danger contained. And the only tool she had ever learned to use was compliance disguised as affection. It had saved her once. She prayed it would save her again. The letter did not soothe Culpeper. It emboldened him. His visits grew longer, more brazen. On the 11th day of August at Liddington, they remained together behind a locked door for hours, the kind of hours that seep into rumor even before the door opens again. Servants might not have pressed their ears to the wood, but they didn't need to. In a world where silence itself told stories, everyone already knew. When Catherine emerged, her face composed, her gown smoothed, her voice pleasant. The damage was already done. Appearances mattered more than truth, and the appearance was damning. The long days of travel, the shifting camps, the endless parade of courtiers created the perfect camouflage for danger. No one truly knew who entered which tent, who walked down which passage, who stayed awake long after the candles burned low. Night after night, the progress offered Culpeper and Lady Rochford new opportunities to maneuver Catherine into silence. Meanwhile, Henry remained content, proud, oblivious, riding at the head of his entourage, as though he were still the vigorous young king who once dazzled Europe. His leg throbbed, his moods flickered, but he believed his queen adored him, and Catherine, ever the survivor, played the part so flawlessly that even the king, who had grown accustomed to betrayal, saw no reason to suspect trouble gathering at the edges of his glittering procession. By late August, the progress reached Pontefract, a great stone fortress whose cold walls had witnessed centuries of tension. It was in one of its heavy, echoing chambers that Catherine and Culpeper met again, this time for 5 or 6 hours, long enough for rumors to take root, long enough for suspicion to weave itself into the stone. Catherine might have felt the gravity of that meeting as soon as she stepped away from the locked door, an inexplicable chill settling into her bones. The path beneath her had narrowed to a thread, and she sensed it. Every time she looked at Henry now, the contrast between her public devotion and her private terror widened until the weight of it pressed against her ribs. The court did not confront her. Not yet. The whispers remained thin, drifting between servants who understood that even acknowledging what they knew could be fatal. But whispers travel. They seep under doors, slip into council chambers, settle into the minds of men trained to detect danger. One of those men was Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, quiet, observant, underestimated. Cranmer listened, and somewhere along the northern route, he began gathering the fragments of a story that would soon hurl Catherine into the abyss. But Catherine could not hear Cranmer's footsteps approaching her future. She only felt Culpeper's presence growing heavier, his expectations sharpening, his eyes resting on her as though her fate were something he believed belonged to him. With every secret meeting, every stiff smile, every trembling letter, the storm tightened, and still she continued, trapped by fear, by habit, by the tragic belief that compliance could undo consequences. The northern progress stretched on, glittering on the surface, rotting underneath, and Catherine, a queen who had never been taught how to defend herself against wolves dressed in velvet, continued walking straight toward the moment when everything would collapse, not because of what she had done, but because of what powerful men believed they had the right to take from her. The northern progress eventually wound its way back toward the familiar architecture of royal power. But Catherine did not return as the same girl who had set out weeks earlier. Something in her seemed stretched thin, as though every secret meeting, every locked door, every whispered conversation with Lady Rochford had pulled threads from her until she could feel the air moving through the spaces that used to be whole. She continued to smile beside the king, continued to play her role with gentle grace, but the shadows beneath her eyes carried a tension she could not name aloud. She had passed from danger into inevitability without realizing it, and Tudor inevitability was always lethal. Henry, meanwhile, arrived at Hampton Court buoyed by triumph. The progress had been a success. Crowds had cheered, nobles had bowed, Catherine had dazzled. His pride swelled, but beneath it simmered a volatile blend of insecurity and exhaustion. His infected leg throbbed constantly, soaking his bandages with a sickly odor that courtiers pretended not to notice. His temper swung from thunderous to tender without warning, and yet he believed fervently, foolishly, that his young queen adored him. It was a belief he needed more than he understood, and the court indulged him in it, No one wanted to be the one to tell the king that the perfect image he'd painted around Catherine was beginning to crack. But someone had to, and the person chosen by fate or duty, or perhaps by the quiet cruelty of Tudor politics, was Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer approached Henry with caution, a man holding a candle near explosives. On the first day of November, in the year 1541, he carried a letter from John Lascelles, a name Henry barely registered, whose sister Mary Hall had once lived with Catherine in the Dowager Duchess's home. The letter outlined Catherine's past with Manox and Derham, details that, in another world, might have been handled with discretion, but Catherine was queen, and in Tudor England, queens did not get privacy, they got judgment. Henry refused to believe it. He did not want to hear the words. He waved Cranmer away with the impatience of a wounded animal cornered by an unwelcome truth. But Cranmer persisted, drawing himself up not in defiance, but in duty. He insisted that the matter be examined for the honor of the crown. That phrase, heavy as a blow, hung in the air. Henry's expression shifted: confusion, disbelief, and then something darker, a sense of betrayal that hollowed his chest before he even knew whether the accusations were true. Investigations began quietly at first, like a ripple spreading across still water. Servants were questioned, past acquaintances summoned. Manox confessed readily, perhaps eagerly, eager to save himself. Derham pressed harder, revealed more than Catherine ever wanted him to, his arrogance collapsing under pressure until the truth of his past with her spread through the council like smoke. Each confession widened the circle around Catherine's life until no corner remained untouched. The king's counselors pieced together fragments, some accurate, many twisted by fear, memory, or malice. And then someone mentioned Culpeper. His name entered the discussion not as a thunderclap but as a quiet rumble, the kind of sound that precedes storms. Servants spoke of late-night meetings, Lady Rochford's involvement, locked doors, hours spent in private chambers. A letter, Catherine's letter, breathing, longing onto the page. Suddenly, the past was no longer the primary concern. The present was. Cranmer reported everything with the calm precision of a man who understood that emotion had no place in royal investigations. But Henry was all emotion now: shock, anger, grief, disbelief. He paced. He bellowed. He grew still and silent in the way that frightened his council most. The idea that Culpeper, his favorite, the man he trusted more than most bloodkin, might have targeted his wife lodged inside him like a splinter. Henry, who had been made a fool in love before, felt the old humiliation rising again, sharper this time because he had believed himself safe with Catherine. She had been young, pure, uncomplicated. A fresh beginning for a king haunted by the ghosts of queens past. Now she was being painted as a seductress, a liar, a woman who had stained the throne. Catherine herself was not yet aware of the full breadth of accusations closing around her. She sensed panic in her attendants, hesitation in their movements, a shift in how they approached her. But she did not understand that the investigation had already spiraled beyond her reach. When she was finally questioned, she clung to fragments of truth that she believed might save her, unaware that in Tudor England, truth was a malleable thing shaped not by accuracy, but by the needs of those interpreting it. Culpeper, upon being interrogated, abandoned charm for desperation. His confessions twisted Catherine into the aggressor, painting himself as a reluctant participant overwhelmed by her attention. It was a lie sharpened by fear, a lie designed to preserve his own life by sacrificing hers. He admitted he had intended to do ill with her words that could only be interpreted as treason, but denied consummation. He believed partial blame would buy him mercy. He had not yet learned that mercy in Tudor England was unpredictable and often deadly in its disappointments. Lady Rochford unraveled under pressure, her nerves fraying, her mind teetering dangerously close to collapse. Her involvement could not be denied. She had facilitated meetings, guarded doors, whispered instructions, whether out of confusion, loyalty, fear, or manipulation. She had become an accomplice in a story she barely understood, and now she would be punished for it. Catherine, moved to Sion Abbey, felt her world shrinking. The rooms were quiet, too quiet. The air held no warmth. She asked often whether the king would show mercy, whether he believed her. She cried, she prayed, she waited. She had never been taught how to defend herself, only how to endure, and endurance alone could not save her now. Henry finally broke. The betrayal, real or perceived, hollowed him from the inside. He ordered arrests. He demanded confessions. He withdrew from public view, a wounded monarch drowning in humiliation. The council moved swiftly. The machinery of royal justice snapped into place with an efficiency that left no room for nuance, no room for sympathy, no room for truth beyond what served the crown. By the end of November, Catherine no longer existed as a queen. She existed as an accusation given human shape. What followed would be swift, brutal, inevitable. But for now, the court waited in tense, breathless silence, knowing the king's rage had not yet reached its peak, and knowing that when it did, the consequences would not be limited to the guilty, the innocent, or anyone in between. In Tudor England, proximity to chaos was enough to guarantee destruction. And Catherine, once the king's beloved, now stood closer to that chaos than anyone else. The days that followed were not days at all, but a slow descent, each hour sinking Catherine deeper into a darkness she could not escape. Once adored, once lifted onto a throne she never asked for, she now existed in suspension, neither condemned nor forgiven, trapped in a purgatory designed to erode what little strength remained in her fragile frame. The palace that had once shimmered around her with gold and music now felt cold, vast, echoing with footsteps that were never coming for her rescue. She waited, frightened, hopeful, then frightened again. In the silence of Sion Abbey, she was finally forced to confront what she had tried for months to outrun the past she feared. The men who haunted her, and the king whose love had crumbled into something far more dangerous. Derham and Culpeper faced trial first, dragged from their cells and placed under the merciless scrutiny of the council. Westminster Hall, cavernous and solemn, had witnessed centuries of confessions, lies, oaths, and executions, and now it bore witness to the unraveling of two men whose stories had become fatally entangled with the Queen's. The evidence against them was abundant: letters, testimonies, gossip turned to fact by repetition. The verdict came swiftly. Both were found guilty of high treason. But in Tudor justice, guilt was only the beginning. The manner of death revealed the true depth of the crown's wrath. Culpeper, bolstered by a lifetime of undeserved mercy, attempted one last plea, and astonishingly, the king granted it. Perhaps Henry could not sever the affection he once felt for him. Perhaps he pitied the boy who had once reminded him of himself, or perhaps favoritism, that familiar Tudor poison, simply would not die. Whatever the reason, Culpeper was spared the full traitor's death. He would be beheaded swiftly, cleanly, almost gently by the standards of the time. Derham received no such mercy. Henry's rage fell heaviest upon him. Perhaps because Derham represented Catherine's past, a past Henry felt had humiliated him long before Culpeper ever entered the Queen's chambers. The punishment he ordered was brutal, even by Tudor standards, hanging until nearly dead, then disembowelment, castration, and finally quartering. A spectacle designed not just to kill, but to erase. When Derham was dragged through the streets toward Tyburn, the crowd saw a man about to suffer for sins they barely understood, while Culpeper, tied to a separate hurdle, watched with the terror of someone who finally realized charm could not save him. At Tyburn, beneath the pale winter sky, Culpeper knelt in the mud, head bowed, hair matted, breath fogging in the cold air. The axe fell in a single stroke. His blood darkened the earth. His body sagged forward. It was over in moments. A quick death. Too quick for the suffering he had inflicted on women whose names history never bothered to record. Derham, meanwhile, met agony blow by blow. He was hanged until the world hovered between shadow and oblivion. Then, while still alive, he was cut down, mutilated, torn apart piece by piece as the crowd's horrified murmur rippled through the air. His cries were swallowed by cold wind and colder steel. When it was done, his remains were displayed as a warning to anyone who might defy the king. The two men who had shaped Catherine's downfall, one through her past, one through her present, ended their lives on the same scaffold. But Catherine was not permitted even the dignity of witnessing their end. She was isolated, guarded, spoken to only in formal tones by men who had already decided what she represented: shame, betrayal, and political inconvenience. By February, the decision was made. Catherine would die. Her final night remains one of the most haunting in Tudor history. A teenage girl, just 19, or perhaps even younger, sat alone in the Tower of London. The walls cold, her chamber dim, the silence thicker than the stone surrounding her. That evening, she asked for the execution block to be brought to her, not out of morbid curiosity, but to practice, to ensure she could position herself correctly, to ensure she would not tremble, would not falter, would not embarrass herself when the blade came down. The idea of a girl kneeling over and over on a wooden block, adjusting her neck, steadying her hands, rehearsing her own death, is almost unbearable, and yet it is the most honest depiction of Catherine Howard the world will ever have. When dawn approached on the 13th day of February in the year 1542, Catherine walked to the scaffold built within the tower grounds. Her steps were steady, her breath shallow but controlled. Witnesses described her as humble, composed, even graceful. She delivered a brief speech in which she claimed she deserved to die, a script expected of Tudor traitors. Not a truth born of her young and tangled life. She knelt, lowered her head onto the block she had practiced with, folded her hands. The executioner raised his axe, and Catherine Howard, child of chaos, victim of neglect, puppet of powerful men, ceased to exist in a single stroke. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, not far from her cousin Anne Boleyn, who had been executed for sins she never committed. Lady Rochford, whose fragile mind had buckled under interrogation, died alongside Catherine and was buried near her. The women lay together in the cold earth, while the men who shaped their downfall, Henry, Culpeper, Derham, lingered in history with narratives far larger than they deserved. But the tragedy extends even further, into a silence no historian can fully recover: the woman Culpeper raped in the forest years earlier. She had no trial, no justice, no elegy, not even a recorded name. Henry's pardon erased her from the official record long before Catherine's execution etched itself into national memory. If Culpeper had been punished for his brutality, then Catherine might have lived, Derham might have lived, Lady Rochford might have lived, and the nameless woman might not have been abandoned to history as a footnote in a story that never belonged to her. Catherine Howard did not die because she was foolish, or immoral, or reckless. She died because powerful men made decisions about her life long before she ever had the chance to make decisions of her own. She died because Henry VIII chose favoritism over justice. She died because she had been taught, from childhood, to survive by yielding and yielding. In the end, placed her directly beneath the blade. Her death marks not just the collapse of one life, but the final proof that Tudor England was a world where innocence could be weaponized, where youth could be devoured, and where the sins of men were often paid for by the women who tried, in vain, to survive them. And so the story closes in silence, the kind that feels less like peace and more like grief settling into old stones.